Hey, this is David Rovix with another episode of my generally every Wednesday and sometimes other weekdays live streamed internet show Discussions with David, which gets turned into a podcast afterwards, which people can find if you look for This Week with David Rovix wherever you get your podcasts, or go to davidrovix.com/this week, or get the David Rovix mobile app. And we're broadcasting live on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook as well. And if you are watching live on one of those platforms and you want to share this with folks, then feel free to do that. And I just realized I didn't put the title of the show or who we're talking to on the bottom, which is generally there. This is not the most professional introduction I've ever done, typing and talking at the same time. However, today we are spending the hour with George Katsiaficas, who is, and I know how to spell his name too. And George was a professor for decades in Massachusetts, and it has authored many books, including some of my favorite books, including The Subversion of Politics and The Imagination of the New Left, and many other books. And he speaks to us now from Chicago, and that's a sloppy introduction, but it'll improve as the show goes on. George, great to see you.
Good to see you, David.
And I I just well, I mean, I was of course I was intending to talk to you about books you wrote, but then recently things came up in terms of my my contacts in Greece who have been in touch with me lately. Some folks I know there about events taking place, which are very sort of event, big deal for a lot of people there, and I may be very difficult to put it into any kind of sensible context for much of the audience out there. But there is a man named Dimitris Koufantinas who's on I guess a month into a water-only hunger strike, and it's looking very bad for his prospects for survival. And I just wonder if I know you actually live part of the time in Athens, and which I only just learned moments ago. But I wonder if you have some thoughts for folks on on what's going on in Greece.
Well, thanks for the question, David, and it's good to be on the show. You know, the Greek penal justice system is, I think, unlike anywhere in the world, insofar as here's Koufantinas. How many murders was he convicted of? I forget, 14, something. He was very tough, left, militant, and imprisoned, and he was given many furloughs to leave the prison a week at a time, go see his family, see whomever. And, he returned to prison. And with the defeat suffered by Greeks, that is, Syriza's selling out to the Germans or to the European Union, and the new elections, which brought new democracy to power. One of the effects, one of many ill effects, has been the end of the furlough program for people like Koufantinas. And he's suffering from that, in that, there's lockdown, searches, everything happening in that prison. And, the Greek movement as a whole has suffered a tremendous defeat. And I think the kind of desperation we see from Demetrius is very similar to the desperation of Bobby Sands, the IRA hunger striker who starved himself to death. And to
A lot of similarities there, aren't there? I mean, in terms of the government that's in power now and the government that was in power when Bobby Sands was on hunger strike.
And to the Red Army fraction, the RAF people in Germany, who, some contend were murdered, others contend committed suicide, or some mix of the two, all in a 3 or 4 month period in Germany. And again, it was the similar context of all three of these tragedies is movements, popular movements, suffering a great defeat. And, the end of the 60s, early 70s, however you want to think of that time frame of the New Left, led to re-examination of people who were very active of their lives. I know for me, it was a very difficult moment when I realized the revolution wasn't happening, not in a linear kind of a process, that it would be building step by step and in a ever ascending process leading to final victory. And
If that's even the case, right? I mean, Martin Luther King said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it tends towards justice, and but I kind of tend more to uh I like, this movie Oh Lucky Man. I don't know, at the end of the movie, I'm not giving it away if you happen to want to see it. It's a very interesting, bizarre movie, but at the end of the movie there's some spray paint on the wall of a city somewhere, and it says, revolution is the opiate of the intellectuals.
yes, yes.
Yeah. And that
Um,
that that feels very real. I mean, because there is, I mean, this arc that we hope exists. I mean, there is no necessarily. I mean, it seems like 12,000 years ago, our brains were bigger and we were smarter. I mean, it doesn't really bode well for the human.
I don't know. I mean, the realization of exactly what you just said, that in our lifetimes, we are not going to be, let's say, conducting ourselves in the ways we had imagined, that there's a tremendous sort of paradigm shift we need to make. Some people cannot do it. I know for me, my kind of transition, I became convinced by many friends that I should write and that what I had to say was of value. I was, frankly, if you must know, I was covered in grease under a car in the driveway at Red House, the commune where I lived, where my friend Lino, who was an illegal from Hermosillo, Mexico, living with us, I came out to, covered in sweat and grease, and he looked at me and he said, "Do you like what you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I have to do it. I have to make money." And he said, "Well, why don't you become an intellectual?" And I said, "Well, you think I could do it?" And he said, "My brother did it, and you're a lot smarter than he is. So I think," and that was the moment I said, "Oh, maybe I should think about writing." People, and I did write a few things for the movement in Ocean Beach, and people responded very favorably. We had a large movement in a small community, and very lucky to have people around like Herbert Marcuse, Frederick Jameson, who spoke at the Left Bank bookstore that I helped to start.
Mm.
And so we had an intellectual, in let's say, an organic intellectual kind of thing going, but it was another step to think of it as a way to make money and to that transition. So I did, as you say, wrote the book on 1968, the global imagination of it, which resonated very well. Until that time, there had been no book that linked all these movements and said the important part of what happened was that internationally, everywhere, people thought we could make a revolution and bring
And
down
I mean,
imperialism.
that's one of the things that was new for me in that book. That was such a mind blowing thing to consider. Was this whole idea that movements can spread that way? I mean, and then you wrote about the book. I mean, and it's been like, I don't know, probably 30 years since I read it, I guess, but I remember it very well. I mean, you wrote about how these different particular years in history, where something gets off the ground somewhere and the way it can spread. And I mean, and since I read that book, I've also, of course, come across this phenomenon that you wrote about in many different cases, historically. And I think 1848 is just an amazing year for that phenomenon of revolt just spreading around Europe and then beyond, around the globe in many instances. But that whole idea of that kind of organizing, if you can call it organizing, like the way that the idea spreads without necessarily uh, being spread by, with all that kind of intentionality. I mean, I think we saw some of that kind of phenomenon taking place with Occupy Wall Street. Would you say? But
Absolutely. I mean, I call this phenomenon you're speaking to the Eros effect. which, by the way, is also my website,
And I
eroseffect.com.
was just going to tell people about that. It was just exploring that, which you were not using that term, I think, when you wrote the book
Oh, I developed
about that.
it
Were you?
I developed it in that book. It was heavily criticized by academics and beloved by activists all over the world who I ran into and who had somehow heard about it. And so the buzz was good and the career implications not so good because obviously I'm
Wow.
celebrating, uprisings as a great form of joy and rationality, of reasonability. And the academy at that point, I think, was coming out of a very conservative tradition. But anyway, not just Occupy Wall Street. I believe that
Can we make a little side note of what you just said and get back to that? Because I think that's a very relevant aspect to the whole discussion. But continue, please. But I wanted to talk about that more too.
there's five waves since 1968. And it's very important to realize that these waves had major waves of grassroots activism had major international repercussions. The
Five
first
waves, you'd say?
five waves after
And
68,
you're talking about in globally or in the U.S. or
no, globally.
globally?
The first one is the disarmament movement, when the
Hmm.
US and the USSR each developed medium range nuclear missiles, and there could have been a nuclear war in Europe without the US or the Soviet Union being hit. And there were overnight millions of people in the streets of Paris, London, Rome, Bonn, all kinds of places. In New York, a million people marched.
1982. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And that led to an end of the Cold War. It convinced Gorbachev that Germany was not going to invade Russia. And so he was able to get rid of the buffer states in Eastern Europe without fear. The second wave was the wave that I wrote about in a two-volume book, Asia's Unknown Uprisings. And after the historic Gwangju People's Uprising in 1980, something like a 20th century Paris Commune, in 6 years, in 9 places, 8 dictatorships were overthrown in East Asia. I'm talking about 5 different religions and dozens of different languages. Somehow people united in uprisings in a region where, most Western observers say, oh, they're not really into democracy. And yet these democratization movements, as I say, overthrew 8 dictatorships. Then comes the revolts, uprisings in the Soviet region, which were heavily influenced by China, which was heavily influenced by the Philippines, which was heavily influenced by South Korea and Gwangju. And of course, in more than 7 countries, regimes were overthrown between 1989 and 1992. Then in the alter globalization wave, which is, I think, when we met, coming from the Zapatista uprising, 1994, Seattle, 1999 became probably the most famous of
Hmm.
those. And then February 15th, 2003, there were more than 30 million people in the streets talking about the ill effects of the G8, of globalization as it existed in capitalism. And, it was, again, had a tremendous influence on debates and policies all over the world. The fifth wave is, as you mentioned, 2011, the Arab Spring, the Spanish indignados, the Greek occupation of the square, and leading to Occupy Wall Street, all of which happened in synchronicity. And I love to tell the story because people say, well, how can you connect the two? I love to tell the story that people in Egypt ordered dozens of pizzas delivered to the Occupy Wall Street protesters. On the,
Ah.
and people, that's okay. People can relate. Now there is real concrete solidarity and international connections to what seemed to be spontaneous uprisings.
Oh, I love the pizza story. That's fantastic. That's a chorus to a song right there. That's a great idea.
I bet you can find it on the
Oh
on
yeah.
yeah, on the web.
I love the way that you lay that out there in terms of the connections between those different uprisings and movements, which aren't always connected with each other. Actually, I mean, it's actually I don't hear, I don't hear other than you talking about it. I never hear people making connections between like the Gwangju uprising and like Tiananmen Square and the Burmese uprising around the same period. They're all
I, yeah,
separated.
no, I mean, in China, very often when a book is or newspaper is something that people think should be read, they take it apart and paste it up on walls, and people will stand and kind of walk down reading it, whichever direction it's going. And I, from a eyewitness who was in Tiananmen, told me a photo book about the Kwangju uprising was taken apart and plastered up in Tiananmen Square so that everybody who wanted to have a look could have a look. And so, there are other connections we could make, but there's a very concrete one that, obviously, in China, an uprising in South Korea against US imperialism would get tremendous play in the media, even with the Chinese censors, or especially with the Chinese censors, one could say.
Mhm.
So people knew about it. And, the events in the Philippines with the overthrow of Marcos in 86, the Korean uprising, June 87, which overthrew the dictatorship. The uprisings in Burma were not well covered in 88, nor were the uprisings in Tibet in 89 covered. But the previous South Korean and Philippines uprisings were very well covered in the media in China, which people have told me that they were able to view footage of it. I remember I was living in Berlin in 1980 in West Berlin, but we could watch East German news and West German news, both of which extensively covered the Kwangju uprising. And I was blown away. I was like, who are these people? When I saw the footage of the armed fighters and the rallies in Democracy Square with 100,000 people debating what to do in the midst of fighting against the military, it was an astonishing event to sort of catch a glimpse of. And it wasn't until 20 years later that I really had the opportunity. I was invited to Korea, and the book on 68 that we were talking about had been translated and become something of a bestseller. It was in its third printing when I arrived, which I had no idea about. And I was,
Really? That
yeah,
happened without your knowledge.
exactly. I mean, I got this sort of email uh, as I recall, I got the email after the book had been translated and published, asking my permission, saying, "Well, we hope you don't mind," or "We hope you agree." And and
Maybe
I
they had a suspicion you really wouldn't mind.
well, they thought that it wasn't going to, that their list, they were a radical publisher, was not selling a huge amount,
Right.
and this one all of a sudden took off because the dictatorship had been ended, and people were really open up to what's happening in the rest of the world, and to hearing, reading that history. So it
Yeah.
really opened a lot of doors. It changed my life. As you know, I fell in love with a woman and love of my life who
From South Korea,
I
which is was meeting her related to your studies of what was going on in South Korea? And
absolutely, she was from Gwangju, and her first words to me when we met, introduced by a mutual friend, were "Yankee, go home." She was she was
excellent.
a heavy duty activist for years and had been working with released North Korean political prisoners, most of whom returned to North Korea. Sadly, she died in 2012,
Mm,
but we had, a good 13
much too
years
young.
together, and much too young. She did produce and direct an amazing film called Veritas,
Mm.
Harvard's History, which won an award at the New York International Film Festival, Best Documentary. And I miss her tremendously still, but Shin Eun-jung. And I'm thinking, in fact, David, even with the lockdown and everything, I want to go to uh, Gwangju to visit her grave and to meet her mother again before
Mm.
too long. So I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to do that. Excuse me, everybody.
Mm.
It appears that my battery is low. Don't ask me how.
Is that what that buzzing is? A low battery?
I don't know. I might have to switch phones in a moment.
Yeah, sure. No
Let's see
problem.
how far we can get.
Let's see. See what happens. The way that the 1980s were depicted in the American media during the time and since then, I mean, it was like a period of sort of everybody was sort of either asleep or making adjustments. There is the phone dying
Sorry
there,
about that.
or oh, no worries.
No, I think I got it. Okay,
All right.
go ahead.
Oh, there you go. There's still that buzzing. Is that over in your end, or am I over here? Well, maybe that's happening
What?
outdoors here. I don't know what's going on. Some
I
kind
don't
of
know.
vibrating sound. As long as it's not, there's no explosion at the end, then it's all good.
All right.
Yeah. Well, it, the 1980s, like, I mean, if you were not at that march in New York City in 1982, and I interviewed one of the organizers of it not long ago, and you would just not know it was happening because the media just pretty much ignored it, and that's how they were with protests generally up until a certain time. When they started paying lots of attention, which it was a strange kind of phenomenon. How they used to just completely ignore us or vilify us, and then they started paying all this attention, like around Occupy Wall Street and around Cindy Sheehan's encampment in Crawford. They're all blanket media coverage. It was kind of very bizarre, and things don't always they haven't been always consistent with how the media deals with these movements. But in the 1980s, there was just they just ignored everything that was happening for the most part. But there was a lot going on all over the world, and as you have written about extensively, and one of those movements that was happening, it was in Europe, and with the autonomous, or in Germany, known locally, the Autonomen, right? The autonomous movement in Germany in the 80s, and as you wrote about in Italy in the 70s, it was a big movement, and it just seems like over the years since then, this movement has been so sort of ridiculed in so many ways, and made to look like some kind of an adolescent reaction to too much prosperity or something like that. But it seems to me that it was an extremely important movement with all sorts of things to say about the basic relations in society and how society should be. Uh, and that's when I was first reading your book, that I think when you had just written the book about the European autonomous movements of the 70s and 80s. I was reading that book when I met a veteran of the Autonomen, a woman in Colorado, from Germany, and followed her back to Germany, and met lots of other sort of former, folks who are of the generation who were in the autonomous movement in the 1980s, and who were still living in places like Hafenstrasse, but were a bit older and often, having kids, and not quite as militant. And of course, there was less happening in terms of the autonomous movement at that particular moment that I was spending a lot of time in Germany. But anyway, it was. There's so much to that time period, and I wonder if you could just talk about the significance of the autonomous movement in Europe of the time and the legacy of it.
Well,
Or
yes. I mean, if after the movements of the '60s, the New Left, really, the what remnants remained became, let's say, old left sectarian type Marxist Leninist groupings and a couple of social democratic endeavors. But in Germany, in Holland, in Denmark, Switzerland, uh, in Italy, there were movements that, as I like to say, were between ballots and bullets, between Marxist Leninist dogmatism and utopian thinking that wasn't tied to practice. And these movements, lived in squatted houses so that their everyday lives became greatly transformed. Patriarchy became an issue with which they grappled, as was capitalism. So they were movements against capitalist patriarchy. They grew out of many streams: the feminist movement, the movement against the military, the movement against war. But they congealed in some kind of revolutionary formation in societies that were not at all ready for revolutions. So they became insular, but they became extremely militant in confronting things like nuclear weapons, nuclear waste. They actually, it's fair to say the autonomous movement in Germany, the Autonomen, in combination with conservative Bavarian farmers, stopped a nuclear reprocessing plant at Wackersdorf, which would have given Germany, West Germany at the time, the ability to build nuclear weapons, which nobody wanted and nobody wants, or very few want. One must say there are those in Germany who do want them. And
But the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, I think he said, farmers are stupid, they won't mind. Right. I mean, they really messed up in their PR campaign at the time that they were trying to start that reprocessing plant. Was it the one in Gorleben, or is this the one
no,
you're talking about?
it was a nuclear waste site. Where I actually was at that encampment many times and helped.
In Gorleben? Yeah, me
But
too.
Wackersdorf was in Bavaria in the south.
Okay,
And it
okay.
was to take nuclear waste and turn it into uranium grade nuclear material that could be used for bombs. And the government itself was so stupid, they believed, oh, these conservative Bavarian farmers and these punked out kids from the cities, the Autonomen, will never be able to talk to each other. Instead, they had this amazing alliance that defeated the German government's plans for the nuclear reprocessing
Ah, I
plant.
love it.
So yeah, I mean, and this movement continued to spread into Eastern Europe, especially after the regimes there were overthrown. But even before, there were, people were aware of what was going on, and France, Spain, squatters movements, and I mean you know, Amsterdam sort of rose and fell, but you know, I think the legacy of these movements was to show the grammar of insurgencies, meaning outside political parties, solidarity with each other, direct democracy, and international understanding of events and movements. This is the definition now of movements. So, looking today, David, at places like the Sudan and Algeria, movements,
Tremendous uprisings going on.
and they have the same grammar. They have that grammar of outside established political parties, direct democracy and assemblies, international solidarity and understanding. What I call the Eros effect, that the movements arise from activity and not with a vanguard. Interestingly, unlike the expectations, let's say, of Marxist Leninists, the activated leadership of so many of these uprisings is not the working class, but it's what we could call professionals who come into the leadership, like, for instance, in the Sudan. Medical professionals, academics, engineers become extremely important to these movements. The working class, and in my study of 10 places in Asia, in almost every one of them, the workers mobilized after the democratization movements had reached their peak. Then workers became activated because they had seen that it was possible to make major changes because of these democratization movements. So I think, the Autonoma were not a working class movement. Many of the people involved came out of the working class, but in terms of, people who had full-time jobs, these were not the Autonoma. They were marginalized, possibly you might say lumpen, although I don't like to use the terms from the 19th century.
It doesn't work so well, right, with contemporary German society, right? If you were to use it, because when I think of the Autonomen that I've known, I mean, at least in places like Hamburg, I mean, you'd say that you could say they definitely come largely out of the middle class, with an educated background, but then they largely subsisted on survived on Germany's generous welfare state, and they were generally experts at navigating the German welfare state. But they were also working their asses off in so many different ways, keeping those squats going, building, so much construction, and then of course fighting the cops. I mean, it's a very busy life, but I don't know how it would have worked without the German welfare state. I mean, it would have looked completely different. Like when I think of the autonomous types here, they're so much less healthy generally, and they're living out of dumpsters, and they're not getting a good balanced diet compared to
Well,
the Germans.
interestingly, every Black Lives Matter chapter is autonomous. There is not a central committee. And so, as I say, what I call the grammar of insurgent movements applies, universally. I mean, as far as I can see, Sudan,
This
Algeria, Black
broad.
Lives Matter, right? It's
And
like
how does the Black Panther? You wrote this wonderful collection of essays with Kathleen, edited with Kathleen Cleaver, on the Black Panther Party, and I mean, it's interesting when you talk about the differences between the sort of the way the Eros effect works and the way these ideas of what you basically anarchist principles of organizing and horizontal organizing, how they spread, whatever we want to, I mean, however we want to characterize these kind of horizontal organizing techniques, they spread. But the Black Panther Party, in a way, it very much fits in with that kind of phenomenon in the sense that they became a very popular phenomenon, much bigger than the organization itself, right? But at the same time, it was also also a hierarchical organization, right?
absolutely. I mean, in my view, that was the principal problem of the Panthers, was that as a hierarchy, Huey was at the top, and he kind of, when he went off in his direction and became a crack addict. I mean, what can you do if you're in an organization where you're, stuck with a leadership like that? But the essay I wrote for that book, the about the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, in September 1970, when more than 10,000 of us gathered in Philadelphia under extraordinarily repressive conditions, but we wrote a new constitution for the United States. And the the I compared the content of what the workshops wrote. We broke down into workshops and wrote about what the society should be like in about 20 different areas. And I compared those with the original 1966, 4 years earlier, Black Panther Party program. And so, for instance, the Black Panther program said they want all prisoners, Black prisoners, to be tried by a jury of their peers. The People's Convention in 1970 talked about an end to prisons and the fact of rehabilitation through communities bringing back their loved ones and working with them to have lives. The Black Panthers program said no Black men should join any army except the Black Liberation Army. The People's Organization constitutional proposal said standing armies should be abolished. There should not be standing armies. Uh, the People's Organization said the use of the word man in every part of the Black Panthers program should be replaced by men and women or human beings. That the family, alternatives to the family should be encouraged. Those documents are all available, on my website, the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention. One of the great unknowns. In fact, there are historians who deny it ever happened. Sorry, folks, I was there. That was the first time I met Muhammad Ali. He was there. I don't remember where I stayed, and I don't remember who I went with. I've asked a couple of buddies, "Hey, where did we sleep?" And they were
Hmm.
like, where did we sleep? I think we slept in a basement of a Black church because they opened their basements to us, and the Panthers, magnificently arranged food for everybody. I mean, we were, but all over the country, buses were stopped so they couldn't get there. The night before the convention, the
Wow.
Rizzo, the police chief, had the Black Panthers in Philly busted and paraded naked. He paraded the men naked through the streets of Philadelphia. But we showed up, and we were very strong. In fact, one of the things that, I mean, some people have written about the Black Panthers, sexism or failure to fully embrace gay liberation. The opposite was the case, in my view. I mean, that was the first time the gay liberation movement made a real public appearance in the movement. when there were, I don't know how many, more than 10,000 of us crowded into this hall, people outside. And the last group to enter were gay people coming in into the upper parts of the bleachers, chanting "gay, gay power to the gay, gay people, black, black power to the black, black people, brown, brown power," et cetera, et cetera. Continue it, and it was really, I mean, it was a goosebump moment. Huey had
Mm,
come out and said that the Black Panther Party supported gay liberation, that any man who was threatened by gay people should examine his manhood, and he
mm,
made a very tough and strong statement about that.
right.
So and the vast majority of the Panthers were themselves women who were not about to take, you know, stuff from men without uh, problems, causing problems. So, uh, I think there's a lot of mythology about the Panthers, but they were a hierarchical organization. But the movement they stimulated, I should say movements, more than a dozen international Panther formations appeared. But even inside the United States, they led a rainbow coalition, which first began here in Chicago with Fred Hampton, helping radicalize Puerto Ricans, Latinos, even white Appalachians, and others in black street gangs in a rainbow coalition. But truly, in the United States, at the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, there were brown berets, there were young lords, there were Iroquois, Asian American radicals. Uh, there were Native American radicals, AIM had formed. So, from the grassroots, all these various uh, formations, which were inspired by the Panthers, certainly, and by the civil rights movement generally, but especially by the Panthers, coalesced together in a major force that wanted to reshape American society and change the Constitution to a truly democratic one.
That sounds an amazing conference, and the document that came out of it, and the opposition to it, and then what came out of that?
Well, that was the first conference in September, drafted the new Constitution, and we were supposed to ratify it 2 months later. And the FBI got any venue that agreed to hold us to cancel, including Howard University, which is where it was supposed to be. And pressure was applied, and people just, we couldn't get, whoever was doing the organizing couldn't get building space. Huey gave a speech in a black church and promised to continue with it, but between then and the split with Eldridge, something very severe happened. The party split, and
Yeah,
so yeah.
because the convention was this constitutional convention, was it largely an initiative of the Black Panther Party? Was that where they?
An initiative specifically of Eldridge,
Right.
and his, because remember, Huey was in prison. Bobby Seale was on trial for his life in New Haven, Connecticut, and Hilliard had been to prison momentarily. David Hilliard momentarily, but he was the only member of the Central Committee who was not in exile, as Eldridge was, or in prison, or dead. And as sincere a person as he is, I think, one person could not hold together the movement. And
No.
he and his brother actually, according to many accounts, really were trying to use force instead of consensus to guide the party forward. And it led to, a real failure in leadership. In fact, Huey got out of prison a few days before the revolutionary, what, about 40 days before? No, how many days? I'm forgetting. Anyway, we all were disappointed with him because as a public speaker, he lacked the charisma that he had as a fighter against the police and a theoretician writing. And I think Huey was disappointed in our disappointment. If you read Hilliard's book, he and Huey said, "Oh, forget about Eldridge's constitutional convention. Let's go party." And they went off somewhere in Philadelphia and partied after Huey's talk. Really didn't arouse people. I mean, Michael Tabor gave a speech that was unreal. I mean, it really electrified people. Audrey Jones, the chair of the Boston Panther, again gave a very inspiring speech. But Huey's speech really fell flat, and sadly, for all of us, he ended up really, leading us in directions that were not particularly healthy.
Hmm. Yeah, and then it's when I as I hear when I hear you talking about the kinds of repression that the FBI was meting out on the Black Panthers, it's just as somebody reading various articles that people write about different things, it's just so many parallels between the FBI's campaign against the IWW, in the 19 teens, that when they just were constantly arresting people for trumped up charges, just to get everybody involved with prison defense and trials and all these, because it's just constant, and not to mention, of course, hanging people under bridges and executing them and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's
Yes.
the FBI's whole legacy. It's been their whole legacy. Their entire. I mean, they're always getting involved with social movements in order to destroy them, and it just. I mean, I think about what's going on today. There's been a lot of social movement activity in 2020, and to say the least, and then I always wonder, what is the role of the intelligence agencies? Where are they positioned here, and what are they? How, in which ways are they trying to sow division? And I mean, everybody on the media is always talking about the Russians, and of course, the Russian government, I'm sure, is involved with sowing division within American
So,
society in whatever different ways. Perhaps everybody's, all intelligence agencies are doing that, but I'm much more concerned about our own.
right, right. And I mean, nowadays there's so many different agencies with, so much power. ICE, for instance, has played a role in repressing, the largest real uprising before Black Lives Matter, which people say, and I think rightfully so, is the largest uprising in U.S. history in terms of numbers. But it was around immigrant rights. You remember in L.A.
In 2006, it was amazing. I mean, everywhere. I mean, yeah, the numbers were absolutely staggering, and it was so barely reported. But and then of course people on the left, unless they were there and really paying close attention, they missed it. So people talk about the biggest demo since such and such, and hardly anybody mentions 2006. But I was living in Houston, which is like 40% Latino, so you definitely did not miss 2006 when those protests were happening. Anyway, yeah. I interrupted you, I think. Did you?
I think I'm not sure. I think
This is what I see. I shouldn't expect my guests to be able to
well,
remember their train of thought when I do that sort of thing. I should be able to remind them where we were at. But
just
yeah.
thinking, you said let's make a note of Greece. I thought you meant Greece
Oh,
and return to
Oh,
it.
I wanted to make a note of your experiences with academia after talking about the Eros effect. I think that's where I was half an hour ago, where I was thinking I
I
wanted to
think
get
this
back
is
to that.
far
But
more
is it?
interesting, if I may say so. I mean, academic politics. I mean, I could tell some stories, but
It's also related though, and how much do we know how much it's related? I mean, look, I mean, as a performer doing this kind of stuff, as a college professor, we're in the same boat in so many ways. At the rumor mill, I mean, you come up with some theory, or you write some
uh,
piece, and then people take it out of context, and you don't know if it's agents doing it, or if it's just people with bad intentions, or people with political disagreements. But I wonder what reflections you have on your experiences with intelligence agencies and provocateurs.
oh, well,
I mean, I'm sorry if
We
that's
did
going in a totally different
about
direction. Happy to talk
how
about
we
Greece too,
were
but
radicalized very kind of overnight by being asked to serve on a blue ribbon panel at MIT to investigate the special laboratories and those days $100 million worth of war research they were doing. And I was the only undergraduate. There were 3 graduate students, but there were more Nobel Prize winners than that. And Chomsky was on it. We had daily transcripts. We went to the Pentagon, met Fulbright, met, the people from DARPA, and blah, blah, blah. And with that information, I came to the conclusion that the war research should be stopped, and basically joined in the radical movement at MIT to try to stop it. Ended up graduating from prison. I was put in prison by MIT. But before that, some of these right-wing magazine writers, as I recall, it was the Alsop brothers or something, wrote an article about radicalism at MIT and said there's, one professor and one student who simply have to be, controlled. And they mentioned Noam Chomsky and me. And so the FBI, stupid as they are, read this article in Newsweek or whatever and said, put me on the shit list, if I may say that. And so
yeah.
from then on, from very early on, I was on the list. And, we now know I was on the New Left Extremist Priority 1 ADEX, which meant in the event of a national emergency, I would have been rounded up. But the point is, I
How
mean,
did
I
you
had
find that out?
uh,
Was it COINTELPRO? Was it uh,
yeah,
the FBI raid, a raid on the office in Pennsylvania that
no,
produced that information? Or
that was earlier. No, this was, uh, some of us filed a suit against Richard Nixon. The ACLU sponsored it because they actually discussed a plan to kidnap us and kill us in Mexico because we were organizing against the Republican National Convention in 1972. Our house was shot up. Paula Tharp was wounded. My car was firebombed by a Mormon FBI funded group called the Secret Army Organization. And we were deeply on the list. And
in very
so,
overt ways, but then also in lots of other more subtle ways. I mean, over the years, and like in ways that you can never know, probably, right?
well, the thing that really irks me a lot to this day is they visited my grandmother
Mm.
and told her they were going to deport her
Oh,
back to. She was born in she would say Constantinople, Istanbul, and that they were going to send her back, as they put it, and of course, terrified her. And this is my grandmother living alone on the East Coast, and she spoke Arabic, Turkish, Greek, English, and French. She went to the French school in Istanbul, and
wow.
that was one of the things that really upset me the most. I mean, MIT ended up putting my mother in prison because she spoke up at the trial and said my son is not a criminal in Greek to the judge, who was Greek, and he ordered her arrested and put in the Charles Street prison in Boston for 10 days. And I mean, so, they didn't just go after me, they went after my family. And it was very difficult because, my father, a career military man, actually sided with the FBI and the authorities. So even when they busted my apartment in Cambridge after I came out of prison, they took all my stuff, but my father went down to the police station and insisted they give him his medals back. He had won the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2 Purple Crosses, the Bronze Star, Silver Star, and framed them and given them to me. And the FBI had stolen them because he asked me when I got out of prison that time, where are my medals? And I said, the police took them. He went down to the police and got them back because he said, look, guys, I don't know what he said, but he was on their side, and he it was actually, frankly, that's why I moved to San Diego. Was I just could not take the giving my family so much pressure,
Mm.
because, I couldn't hide. I mean, when I got busted once, it was in the media. And I mean, many times, but I mean, once in particular, I called my mom to wish her happy birthday. And she said, "Why are you calling me from prison, from jail?" And I said, "Mom, I'm not in jail." She said, "Yes, you are. I saw it on the news." And I said, "Well, I was called to say happy birthday." You know, I mean, she went on to become an activist in her own right, was elected 3 times to the New Hampshire House of Representatives, sponsored the
Mm.
nuclear freeze and
Wow.
the spousal rape amendment, which made rape among married people a crime,
Great.
and, feminist study groups, et cetera, et cetera. But the pressure on my family, I remember, okay, look, I don't know how we got on this topic. Once we were busted, the Juche bust, it was called. We were Panther Defense people. They battered down the door, came in looking like the French Connection, if you remember the bust at the end, with the overcoats and the badges and the machine guns. And Ellis, this cop who had lost part of his nose in the riot for Bobby Seale I had helped
Mm.
organize, came in with a Thompson submachine gun, put it in my cheek, and said, "Move, and I'm going to blow your head off, Katsiaficas." What went through my mind at that moment?
Mm.
Fear? No. It was, oh my God, my poor mother. If this guy blows my head off, will she ever recover from this? I
Hmm.
mean, so I had to get out of Massachusetts at that point. But little did I know that at the other end of the country in San Diego, it would be even more intense in terms of what happened.
Then you moved there, and that was around the time that Pete Boehmer's house got shot
That was the
by.
same house. It was our collective house. Yeah.
Oh, you lived there too.
Well,
Sorry,
all
I don't know
all
why
of
that's
us,
funny.
yeah. No, I don't know of other groups that were shot up like we were.
Right. No, that would have been the same, I guess.
Yeah, it was an
What about
OCD.
the same? At the same time, the FBI was engaging in the most unbelievable kind of, I guess, like the kind of stuff that you just couldn't believe until you actually see that it was real, like writing love letters that were not real, pretending to be somebody else in order to create divisions in the Black Panther Party. But I know they were doing that with within your circles as well. I mean, not not that with throughout the left, with the SDS, the anti-war movement, Black Panther
So
Party, whatever, right?
we were the group at where we lived in our house, 11 people in a 3-bedroom. And every Friday night we would get high and talk about what we had done that week and what we wanted to do the next week and what days. I think we had 3 cars among us. What days people needed cars to go to meetings. We were published in the community newspaper, the Ocean Beach Rec. We helped start a food co-op. We helped start the San Diego Convention Coalition. We spied on some of the liberal groups that were trying to take over the anti-convention stuff. So we were real organizers. Up the street from us, there was a group of people called MDM, Movement for a Democratic Military. They were Marxist-Leninists. We were friendly, but they made fun of us to our faces. They said, "You people smoke pot. You're not serious revolutionaries," blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, the FBI stole a handgun from their house, and that was the gun used to shoot Paula Tharp at our house. So going forward, if they had succeeded, which they did not, because, well, I could talk about it later, but you see what I'm saying. So they not
Wow,
only,
they were trying to create
that's
a
right,
war between you guys, basically.
that's right.
Yeah,
And they would have had evidence, right? They would have had the gun. They would have matched,
forensic evidence.
right? There was I mean, the gun, the Mormon shooter, what was his name? I forget, George Hoover, was
What, really?
yeah,
Great.
went into the window frame. So there was a slug right there. And the second one, went into Paula's arm, and she was never able to fully extend her arm after that. So, yeah, they would have had forensic evidence linking the MDM people to the attack on our house, on our collective house. So that was in the movement. Typically, splits were made more severe, like the us and the Panthers, right? The FBI sent notes to each side saying, the other side, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill you. And it led to more and more security, tensions. And as you remember, John Huggins and Bunchy Carter were killed by US member Tom Boozy in LA at UCLA in a dispute over
Remind me of that. That was a
student government money and allocations to black groups. The US
wow.
member, being at the time it was called US, shot and killed John Huggins and Bunchy Carter on the campus. And Bunchy, of course, was one of the leaders of the Slauson Street Gang. Was a very, I think he was the captain of the LA branch of the party. Very important organizer. And John Huggins, who had been married to Erica Huggins, who remains very prominent in Hollywood and film production. And she was on trial for her life with Bob Basile in New Haven. So they really struck at the center of the party there in those assassinations.
Yeah. When you when I think about the future, there's so many interviews where they're always asking people like, what gives you hope at the end of it, but it's like, I'm not sure if that's a very good question, because I mean it just seems like well, you were mentioning earlier on that the arc of justice goes in somewhere or another in the right direction eventually, something along those lines. But do you think it really does?
No, I don't. I'm sorry.
No.
I agreed with what you said. I think you misunderstood me, that there was a point in my life where I realized revolution was not a linear ascending process, and that perhaps
or not ascending at all. Maybe.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Is look what we're doing to the planet. Look what we're doing to
Yeah.
each other. We can't say. And I liked what you said. I mean, I don't know if you know philosopher Ibn Khaldun, who was, postulated the labor theory of value, postulated evolution 400 years before Marx and Darwin. Uh, but he liked to talk about augury, intuition, fortune tellers, astrology, and all these ways that our brains functioned coming out of our traditional mystical types of knowledge. And the knowledge today that we're only using a small fraction of our brains, that the focus on rational scientific thought has overwhelmed other parts of the brain. Of course, rational scientific thought has made tremendous technological progress, but at a great cost. And moral development has lacked. Ethical development, forget about it. And mystical powers. I think if one of my daughters calls herself a witch and is part of a coven and is very radical, I don't know, and they are reclaiming that kind of knowledge or seeking to reclaim it. And, it seems to me young people's, what is often called identity politics, actually has a universal truth to it and a universal appeal. The easiest way for me to explain it is to say black music is our music. It's universal music. It's not just for black people. And I think, feminism means the liberation of all of us from restrictive gender roles. Trans gay liberation means all of us are going to be freer to be fully who we are. And, so it really bothers me when, universal and particular are opposed to each other. I think we have to find the universal in the particular. And so that's what I think is going on with a lot of grassroots movements in the universe these days.
And do you ever just look at how messed up things are and think, well, if we ended up with another one of those moments where the right kind of sort of methods of organizing and the right kinds of goals were to just sweep around the world as has happened in the past, that could just change the whole equation, the whole future.
Well, I'm not sure that one single insurrectionary period can change the whole thing. I mean, when I was talking about myself, thinking a revolution would happen in my lifetime, I fully, even when I denied that and said, okay, look, I better become an intellectual to support myself and also to help be part of the movement, I thought when I was going to be the age I am now that we would be the ones in Washington taking over or trying to take over. But it's the far right, the neo-Nazis, Alpha 66 progeny, who are the ones who are there. So it's, you know, history moves in very strange ways, as we both acknowledge, not in a linear fashion, not in an ascending fashion. And I think what it's going to take are many such periods of insurgencies to attune not only, let's say, humanity generally, but also those of us who remain, let's say, committed for life to some kind of transformation. And the problem, of course, is that in these periods, individuals like Huey Newton will rise to prominence and then mislead movements. And I think that's why Black Lives Matter having no single leader and, you know, autonomous chapters, and why autonomy is such an important concept. I believe the lessons of Occupy Wall Street, for instance, of the Gwangju uprising, are that mass assemblies, popular assemblies, as in the, you know, the movements that we have seen, are increasingly going to be the way in which decisions will be made. We've seen it in the Sudan and in Algeria most recently. These are now becoming universally accepted all over the world. And I think even though assemblies will not be enough, that the consciousness, international consciousness, how can a unified program develop that can break down these global structures that oppress us all? And that's, I think, the real challenge, is to try to understand, you know, not having centralized hierarchical organizations, having assemblies, but how to link them up in a universal fashion.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, and I was going to let you go, but I have to then ask, speaking of what you just said, what about what are your thoughts on what is it called, the DM movement, or the group that Yanis Varoufakis started up?
Yeah, yeah, Varoufakis. There is a review of his book on my website, but briefly, those who work within the system have to obey the laws of the system. We've seen this time and again. For instance, in Germany, people who opposed the Gorleben nuclear waste site became so popular in their home district, they got elected to the parliament. One of them became the interior minister of the state in which Gorleben was located. And when her friends and housemates and comrades sat down to stop trucks bringing nuclear waste to Gorleben, she was ordered by her superiors to call the police. And she did it. She called
Wow.
the police. And this is, we're talking about people, you know, who are committed, who are radical, who have knowledge, and who were elected on that basis, basically being, you know, put in a position where they have to obey the law. And I think, you know, Varoufakis is right. He's smart, but he played within the system. And I think when you do that, then you accept the system. You've already lost the possibility of revolutionary transformation. I think, like, much as I love and respect Bernie Sanders, you know, AOC, all of the sort of very progressive elements within the Democratic Party, that ain't the socialism that I was, you know, hoping for or believe in. You know, let's forgive all the student loans. Great. Let's do a Green New Deal. Fabulous. But that still ain't freedom. That's still not a free society. That's still not a socialism worthy of the name, in my opinion.
Here, here. Thank you so much, George. This has been absolutely fascinating, and I think other people will agree as well.
Great to connect again, David. And
Yeah, great talking to you.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
See you around, I hope.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao. And thanks for tuning in to this discussion with George Katsiaficas. And check out eroseffect.com, where you can find all of his books and a lot of other information on there. And you can find this discussion archived if you go to youtube.com/drovics and then look for the Discussions with David playlist or This Week with David Rovics playlist, which you can also find if in audio form if you look for This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, wherever, or go to davidrovics.com/thisweek or get the David Rovics mobile app. And I will be back on Friday doing another interview with Laurel Krauss, actually. And I'll just let you find out who Laurel Krauss is. If you don't know who Laurel Krauss is, it's a common name. I'll give you a little hint. Her sister's name is Allison, but she's not a musician. Okay, and I will just sign off for now. And remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.